I'm Elif. I work on the Android Jetpack team, and I specifically work on the room library, and today we're going to talk about the latest room renovations we've been doing. So before that, because this is a lightning talk and we usually kind of cut it very close to the end, I have a QR code if you want to ask questions and everything, or if you just don't want to stick around and run to lunch after this, you can submit questions or comments or anything through that QR code, and I'll have that on the last slide as well. Okay, so what is Room? For anyone who hasn't gotten a chance to check it out yet, Room is an Android X library that helps you use SQLite databases in your Android apps by using its annotation processing APIs that generate code. Earlier in May, we actually announced that Room went KMP, which is super exciting. It has been a multi-year effort. And originally an Android-only library, Room now supports JVM Desktop as well as native, so iOS, Mac, and Linux, in addition to Android from version 2.70 Alpha 1 or higher. So we've had a couple more alpha releases since then. So what does this mean? So how do you go about using Room in a project? And let's talk about if you were to start from scratch. So you have a new project and you want to add Room KMP to it. How do we go through getting that done? So you start by obviously setting up the environment, which means build files. You add the Room Gradle plugin as well as KSP. And for the Room Gradle plugin, you'll also need to set up the schema export directory. Other than that, you'll need to set up your source sets. So that means adding the runtime part of the Room library to your common source set. Again, note the version 2.70 Alpha 1 or higher for KMP. And lastly, you'll need to set up the Android X Room compiler, so the KSP processor that generates code. And that'll be enough to just get you, environmentally set up. Next up, you'll need to define some Room classes if you actually want to use Room. So, like I said before, Room is the kind of the database library. And to be able to use Room, you first need to kind of define your database in terms of Room. So you would create your tables. Let's say you want to make a database for your pets. So you have a dog and a cat table, and tables are called entities in Room. And this is how you would define them. They're data classes, and you would annotate them with @entity to let Room know that it needs to process this accordingly as a table. Next up, you will need to define what we call DAOs. So a DAO is a database access object. It's essentially an interface or an abstract class that houses the functions that you define to do database operations on your Room database. So for example, we have two inserts and a query function here. So inserting a dog or a cat into your database, or just getting all the dogs. And these can have various return types. And to put all of these together, you define your Room database class. So how you do this is you define your database class that extends Room database. Using the @database annotation, you let Room know what tables you have, so the dog and the cat table. You pass them in as the entities, and you set the database version. And lastly, you include your DAO as one of the member functions. And this is enough to kind of get you started on how you would use Room. Next up, you will need to select an SQLite driver. So if you're a previous Room user, this is actually a new concept. We just added this with the KMP version of SQLite. So what do I mean by all of this? So the Android X SQLite library itself contains abstract interfaces with basic implementations that can be used to build your own libraries that access SQLite. And within this library, for the KMP version of SQLite, we created what we refer to as drivers. So these are APIs that abstract over SQLite, depending on the use case, and they closely follow the core functionality of the SQLite C API. You can actually, so these drivers, you don't have to necessarily have KMP to use them. You can actually use them standalone for very different reasons. I'll actually be mentioning them here and there as we go through the talk. But for this purpose of this presentation, we're going to be talking about how you would use them with Room. So in the SQLite driver APIs, we have three main interfaces. The SQLite driver, which is the entry point to the SQLite, to use SQLite, and it is essentially responsible for opening a connection, which is an SQLite connection. An SQLite connection represents an SQLite 3 object, essentially a database. And lastly, we have the SQLite statement. If you hadn't guessed by the name, it's an SQLite statement representing an SQLite 3 statement object. So for flexibility, we actually created two different types of drivers. So first off, we have the bundled SQLite driver, and this is actually what we recommend you use in your projects. And the reason because of that is that it includes the SQLite library that's compiled from the source, offering the most up-to-date and consistent version across all supported KMP platforms. We recommend this for KMP, but also even if you're not using KMP, if you were to use the bundled SQLite drivers, let's say you have an Android project, the bundled SQLite driver will have the bundled version of SQLite, which again provides consistency no matter which Android version the app is running in. If you alternatively want to use the operating system provided SQLite, you can use the framework SQLite APIs. So how you would add this to your project is you go back to your build file, and if you're using the SQLite bundled version, you put it in your common main dependencies, and if you're using the framework one, you'll need to put it on the source set dependencies according to whichever one you're going to use. And once you select which driver you want to use, lastly, you will need to configure and instantiate the Room database. So to be able to instantiate a Room database, you actually first need to define a database builder to instantiate it. This actually is the only part of the Room API that we require you to implement platform specifically, and this is due to the differences between the file system APIs. So in the Android version, for example, the database location you usually get through the context, and this is how you would define the database builder. If you've used Room before in your Android projects, this is the same as before, so nothing has changed here. But for iOS, things are a little bit more tricky. So again, you need the database location. For the purposes of this just example, we use the NS home directory, but you probably want to pick a different and better place. And to create the database instance, you actually, for this case, need to provide the path, but in addition to the path, you need to provide a database factory. So what do I mean by a database factory? So a database factory is going to be a Lambda function that invokes a generated extension function whose name is instantiate_impl. It has a receiver of type k-class T, where T is the type of the @database annotated class. And I should note that this generated function, it's generated in the same package as the @database annotated database class that gets generated. So if you want to use it from anywhere else, you'll need to import it. This is a question that we've been getting on our bug reports a lot. Seems to be a point of confusion. And this actually is a workaround that we came up with because we don't have reflection that the way Android has it. And if you have any ideas on how we can get around this better, we're open for suggestions. But for the time being, this is what we have. We fully intend to, if we can come up with a better solution, replace this solution that we have. Lastly, for JVM Desktop, things are pretty simple, actually. You just need to provide a database path. You don't need a context or a factory. In this case, again, the example I have here is a temporary directory, just for the purposes of this presentation, and you should probably, again, find a better location to put your stuff. And then, okay, once you have your database builder from one of the platform-specific constructors, you can configure the rest of Room database in the common code along with the actual database implementation. And by configure, what do I mean? You need to set the driver that you're going to use. So if you're using the bundled SQLite driver, you use the bundled SQLite driver here. Or if you're using the Android-specific one, you would call the Android SQLite driver or the native SQLite driver if you're using the other framework SQLite driver. And that should get your foot out the door, getting started with like a brand new project. But a more important question is probably, what if you had an existing project that uses Room and you want to move to use Room KMP? So this is going to be a little more tricky, obviously, because you already have so many existing usage that you're going to have to migrate. So the first step that you're going to have to do is to migrate from support SQLite to SQLite driver. And this is a big task, but you can actually do this incrementally, and I'll actually say more on that later on in the presentation. But basically, if you have usages such as like executing a query like this, where you use a support SQLite database, you can just simply replace it with the SQLite connection. And you can see like they're very similar, but they're not quite the same. You know, like you have get text instead of get string. Like some things are a little bit different, but it's not too bad. Again, for various callback overrides, you also need to migrate them to use the SQLite connection, SQLite driver APIs. And another example, last example, you also need to migrate your database transaction APIs. And for those, we have room database.useWriter connection, as well as useReader connection. It's not on this slide, which is essentially the equivalent of API of just database, open helper, writable database, and readable database. And the reason why I want to shout out this specific thing, this specific change, is that it might be important for you if you have an app that has usages of support SQLite database outside of Room. So once you're done, or once you get started moving over to the SQLite drivers, you can actually kind of do these in parallel. You need to migrate to using coroutines. So this, if your app is already using coroutines, that's great news. But if not, it's going to be a really big first step that you're going to have to take for your app, and you might need to introduce some interoperability. And what I mean by that is just this is not an easy task. It really depends on what the current state of your app is while it's using Room. And what do I mean by migrate to coroutines? So for example, the KMP version of Room relies on coroutines to perform I/O operations on the configured coroutine context. This means that we can't have any blocking DAO functions, so you would need to migrate all of those to become suspend functions. Another example is some reactive types, such as live data, will need to be, is not KMP compatible and will need to be migrated to coroutine flows. So next up, the biggest chunk, I guess, you need to actually move your Room declarations to common. So let's say we go back to the original example of the pet database where we had this database definition. And let's look at the DAO again, but I did slightly change this example so that it would work in my favor and I could make my point. So the second one used to be a suspend function, but in this example, it's a blocking DAO function. So what do you do if you have a mixture of like suspend and blocking DAO functions in your originally Android Room project that you want to move? Well, our suggested strategy here is to use expect actuals. So what you would do is you would define another DAO and put the expect interface in the common source set, and then you would implement, you would define the actual interface in the source set that you're going to need to define it in, which is Android in this case because it's a blocking function and it's only allowed here. And you would put, you wouldn't put it, but you would like let it remain on the Android side while you're migrating. And your other functions can move to common main like this. So once you're done with all of that, the very last step is going to be, again, to configure the Room database. And here I want to circle back to what I said before in regards to migrating the support SQLite database stuff to the drivers. So what we chose to do here is until you set the driver, Room will actually Room will actually be in what we call compatibility mode. So you can actually start moving your stuff over to the driver APIs without having everything be in the new driver APIs. And this allows you to kind of keep making sure that nothing broke on the Android side while you're moving everything to common. It's kind of more for like a sanity check. Also, you can't really move everything all at the same time and just disable the entire library functionality until you're completely done. This was definitely a big point of concern for us while we were migrating Room, which is huge. And the backend will actually the backend has like a bridge kind of implementation that takes care of the differences between the two while you're migrating. And then once you do the set driver, we're using a bundle SQLite driver, Room will expect that everything is in the driver implementations and not in the support SQLite stuff. So that's very important. So you need to do this last if you're doing it in that incremental way. And that's it. Those are some of the strategies that we had. But there's many more that you might run into, so I definitely recommend checking out the documentation we have in regards to how to do all of this. Lastly, I want to shout out the key feature differences with KMP that we have, because we've had some questions about this. So right now we have some functionality that we haven't quite migrated over to KMP yet that we fully intend to do, and then some will only need to remain on the Android side, which are going to be the raw query DAO function support, which will be added in future, prepackaged databases and query callbacks, and auto-closing databases as well as multi-instance invalidation will need to remain on the Android side because it can't be supported anywhere else. And that's it. Well, thank you, and please go try Room KMP, give us feedback. You can complain on the Buganizer. I am the one person who gets directly assigned to everything, and I get yelled at by strangers all the time. So you can also submit your questions about this talk here, and thank you.